My name is Kendall Clark, and I never imagined the two people I trusted most would be the ones to destroy my life. My ex-husband didn't just leave me. He left me for my wealthy best friend, parading their perfect life while I was left with nothing. But 4 years later, the tables turned, and when he saw who I married, his face went pale. The chandelier light above the ballroom threw a sharp glint off the diamond on my left hand, and for a split second, I caught him staring at it like it had the power to burn him. My ex-husband, Matthew, was standing at the far end of the room, a crystal flute of champagne halfway to his lips, frozen mid-sip. His perfectly rehearsed smile slipped the second his eyes locked on me, and then on the man beside me. I could see the question in his face, the panic swelling behind his eyes. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. Dallas is big, but not big enough for something like this to happen by accident. His gaze darted between me, the ring, and my husband's hand resting protectively at the small of my back, as if every detail was a puzzle piece he didn't want to put together. The music from the string quartet swelled, masking the sound of my heels against the polished marble floor as I began to walk toward him. Every step was deliberate. I wanted him to feel the air tighten with each inch I closed between us. The people around us were laughing, talking, sipping their drinks, completely unaware that the man in the corner was seconds away from watching his own personal hell take shape. 4 years ago, Matthew had walked out of our marriage without so much as a backward glance. He didn't just leave. He left me for her. My best friend since college. The woman I used to tell all my secrets to. The one who stood beside me as maid of honor, holding my veil while I vowed to love him for the rest of my life. She was the one he chose when he decided my life wasn't enough. I remember the night I found out. A Friday, rain pounding against the windows of our townhouse, my phone lighting up with a text from her that wasn't meant for me. A photo. Them. In Cabo. His arm around her waist, her lips against his cheek. The caption read, "Couldn't be happier." My hands shook so violently I dropped the phone. He didn't even deny it when I confronted him. In fact, he smiled, told me I'd grown stale, that I didn't match his ambitions anymore. But standing here now, in a ballroom filled with Dallas's elite, I was not the same woman he walked away from. My dress was a deep emerald silk that caught every flicker of light, cut perfectly to my figure, daring but refined. My hair was swept into a low chignon, a few loose curls framing my face. And on my arm was the man Matthew never thought I could have. The one who was about to make him choke on every smug word he'd ever spoken. Matthew's wife, my former best friend, wasn't here yet. I knew she'd arrive fashionably late. It was her style. She'd glide in expecting to own the room, expecting all eyes to be on her. What she didn't know was that I had set the stage for her entrance to be the moment the ground cracked open beneath their perfect little life. As I drew closer, Matthew straightened his jacket, trying to compose himself, but his grip on the champagne glass had tightened, the rim trembling against his lip. I could smell his cologne before I reached him, the same one he wore when he came home late, reeking of someone else's perfume. "Kendall," he said finally, his voice lower than I remembered, forced into a calm he didn't feel. "It's been a while. 4 years, 11 months, and 16 days, I replied, my tone silk over steel. His jaw twitched. I didn't take my eyes off his, but I could feel my husband's presence beside me, the quiet authority in the way he stood. The man Matthew was now seeing for the first time. Matthew's gaze flicked toward him, lingering for just a second too long. Recognition didn't hit immediately, but it would. And when it did, it would hit hard enough to knock the breath out of him. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, trying to place the face, the name. The memory was there. It was just buried under years of arrogance and the assumption that I'd always stay beneath him. "You look different," Matthew said finally. "New ring suits you." "Oh, it does more than suit me," I replied, letting the words hang in the air just long enough to make him shift his weight. I wanted him uncomfortable. I wanted him anticipating the blow before it landed. From across the ballroom, a ripple of murmurs began. the kind that spreads when someone important has just walked in. I didn't even have to look to know it was her. I felt it, the slight change in the air, the faint scent of her perfume even above the flowers and champagne. My former best friend, the woman who stole my husband and smiled while she did it, was here. And she was walking right toward us. Matthew's posture shifted again, a subtle lean as if to brace himself. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew enough to sense that tonight wasn't going to end in his favor. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, the kind of calm that comes when you know you hold every card in the deck. As she approached, her eyes swept over the room before landing on me. For a second, her smile faltered. Not much, but enough for me to see the spark of recognition, the tiny seed of unease. She glanced at my husband, then back at me, and that was when I saw it. The faint crease between her brows as her brain caught up with her eyes. The string quartet shifted into a new piece, the opening notes sharp and precise, like the tightening of a noose. The conversations around us blurred into background noise. My world had narrowed down to the three of us standing in this perfect little triangle, the balance of power shifting with every heartbeat. Matthew opened his mouth to speak, maybe to smooth things over, maybe to feign indifference. But before he could, my husband reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small envelope, and held it casually at his side. Matthew's eyes locked on it like it was a live grenade. He didn't know what was inside. But I did. I had written every word myself. The room felt smaller, hotter. I could see beads of sweat at his temple despite the cool air conditioning. My former best friend took a step closer, her hand brushing his arm, her voice low and questioning. I didn't hear her exact words over the music. I didn't need to. I knew this was the moment they'd both start to realize the evening had been choreographed from start to finish. By me. And I hadn't even played my opening move yet. 4 years before the ballroom, before the envelope in my husband's hand, my world looked perfect. At least, from the outside. I was 32, living in a sunlit 3-bedroom townhouse in the uptown district of Dallas. The kind of place with big bay windows, a balcony that overlooked the magnolia trees, and a kitchen I'd spent months perfecting. White marble counters, brushed gold fixtures, and a coffee station I treated like a sacred ritual every morning. My life moved in clean, predictable rhythms. I'd wake before Matthew, slip into my silk robe, grind fresh beans, and sit at the kitchen island with my laptop while the city slowly came alive outside. Matthew would come down the stairs half an hour later, always in tailored slacks and a crisp shirt even before breakfast. He said it helped him get into the mindset of a winner. That was Matthew. Everything had to project success, even when no one was watching. He'd kiss my cheek, ask for his coffee black, and scroll through his phone while I plated breakfast. Sometimes he'd share a news headline with me. Sometimes he'd just grunt. At that time, I didn't think much of it. I told myself this was just his way, focused, ambitious, a little self-absorbed but not unkind. We had met when I was working in event planning for a luxury hotel downtown. He was a corporate client, in town for a week-long conference. He'd noticed me from across the lobby and, in typical Matthew fashion, wasted no time making his interest known. He had charm, the kind that made waiters remember your name and strangers feel like they'd met you before. He made me feel chosen, like I'd been handpicked for a life that would always be bigger and better than whatever I'd dreamed up for myself. And I had dreams. I wanted my own event firm one day. I'd sketched out business plans, run numbers, even started building a list of potential clients. Matthew encouraged it, though sometimes his encouragement felt performative. He'd tell me I was more than capable, but then make little comments about how unpredictable entrepreneurship could be, how nice it was that at least one of us had stability. At the time, I laughed it off. I thought he was just being cautious. We had our routines, date nights at new restaurants, weekends spent with friends at lake houses, summer trips somewhere sunny. My best friend, Danielle, was always in the picture. She and I had met freshman year at SMU, bonded instantly, and never really let go. She was my ride or die, the person I called for everything from relationship rants to shoe advice. She loved Matthew. He loved that she loved him. I saw it as a blessing. My two favorite people getting along so well. The three of us would grab brunch together, trade sarcastic jabs, split bottles of wine on my back porch. Danielle was glamorous in a way that felt effortless. Glossy dark hair, perfect lipstick, and that subtle perfume you couldn't forget. She came from money, but never flaunted it outright. At least, not with me. Looking back, there were small things I ignored, like the way Matthew's eyes lingered on her just a beat too long when she told a story, or the way they'd sometimes share a look I couldn't quite read. Not intimate exactly, but something. I'd tell myself it was in my head. That's what love does. It teaches you how to explain away the things you don't want to see. Professionally, Matthew was climbing fast. He'd just been promoted to VP at a real estate investment firm, which meant more late nights, more business trips, and a new social circle, wealthier clients, higher-end events, dinners at places with valet service and $100 steaks. I adapted. I learned how to make conversation with people who measured worth in square footage and portfolio returns. And for a while, I loved it. I loved the way Matthew's hand rested on the small of my back at these functions, the way he introduced me as my wife, Kendall. She's the brains behind every party you wish you were invited to. I loved the feeling of being a team. But there were cracks. The first was small enough to miss if you weren't looking. It was late spring, and we were hosting a rooftop cocktail party for one of Matthew's biggest clients. Danielle was there, in a gold silk dress that caught the last rays of sunset. I was busy managing the catering staff when I glanced over and saw her laughing at something Matthew had said, her hand lightly touching his arm. Nothing about it screamed danger, just two friends sharing a moment. But then Matthew leaned in, his mouth close to her ear, and she tilted her head toward him like they were sharing something they didn't want the world to hear. It was brief. Seconds. But when she caught me looking, her smile faltered before snapping back into place. The second crack came a month later. I had just finalized a contract for a high-profile wedding, my biggest event yet. I was buzzing with excitement, already planning how to reinvest the deposit into my business. When I told Matthew over dinner, expecting him to share in my enthusiasm, he nodded and said, "That's great, babe. But you're still going to keep the house stuff as your main focus, right? I mean, the business is just side income." It was like someone had poured ice water over the table. I laughed it off, told myself he didn't mean it that way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he saw my ambitions as a hobby, something to keep me busy while he played the role of the real breadwinner. Then there was the weekend in Austin. We'd been invited to a friend's lake house for the 4th of July. Danielle came too. Of course she did. We spent the afternoon on the water, the three of us laughing, drinking, soaking in the sun. That night, as fireworks lit up the sky, I went inside to grab more drinks. When I came back out, Matthew and Danielle were on the dock, their heads bent close, voices low. I couldn't hear what they were saying over the bursts of light and sound above us, but when they noticed me, they stepped apart like the conversation had just ended. It was nothing. At least, that's what I told myself. The red flag, the real one, came in September. Matthew had just returned from a 3-day conference in Houston. I was unpacking his suitcase when I found a folded receipt from a hotel spa. 2 massages, one after the other. Same afternoon. He claimed it was a client perk, that they'd booked it for him and a colleague. He said it so smoothly, so casually, that I almost believed him. Almost. It was the first time I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. The first time I wondered if the life I'd built wasn't as solid as I thought. But I didn't push. I told myself I was overthinking. I put the receipt in the trash and went back to making dinner. I didn't know it then, but that was the start of the end. It happened on a Friday. I remember because I'd just wrapped up a week of back-to-back client meetings, the kind that leaves you running on caffeine and autopilot. Dallas was in the middle of one of those late winter rains that seem to seep into your bones. Steady, cold, unrelenting. I'd driven home with the wipers fighting to keep up, my mind already on the bottle of Merlot I'd been saving, and the quiet night I planned to spend curled up on the couch. When I walked in, the house was dark. No warm glow from the kitchen, no sound of Matthew's voice drifting down the hall. I kicked off my heels, called his name. Silence. I told myself he was working late again. It wasn't unusual. I went to the bedroom to change, tossing my phone onto the dresser. That's when it lit up. It was a text from Danielle. At first, I thought she'd sent it to me on purpose, a silly selfie maybe, or some inside joke. But when I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. It was a photo. Her. Matthew. On a beach I didn't recognize. His arm was slung low around her waist, his hand resting where it used to rest on me. She was kissing his cheek. Her eyes closed like the moment was something sacred. And then the caption, "Couldn't be happier." My brain scrambled to make sense of it. Surely it was old. Surely there was some context I didn't understand. My pulse was so loud in my ears I almost didn't hear the front door open. Matthew walked in, shaking rain from his coat. I held up the phone. "What is this?" My voice sounded strange, too calm for the way my heart was racing. He glanced at the screen, then at me, and in that instant I saw it. Not guilt, not panic, just irritation. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, as if I'd opened a package marked fragile. Then, without breaking eye contact, he closed the door behind him and set down his briefcase. I could feel my hands shaking. "You're sleeping with her?" He shrugged. "I have been for a while." The room tilted. "A while?" "Kendall?" he said, like he was explaining something to a child. "You and I? We've been done for a long time. You just didn't want to see it. You've gotten stale, predictable. I need someone who matches where I'm going, matches where he's going." The words burned like acid. Danielle, my best friend, my maid of honor, my sister in every way that mattered, was apparently the one who matched him now. I asked him if he had any idea what this would do to me. He actually laughed. "You'll be fine. You've always been resourceful." That laugh snapped something in me. For hours after, I couldn't stop pacing. He didn't apologize. He didn't beg. He packed an overnight bag while I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the rain streaking down the window. The man I'd built a life with, defended, trusted, was walking out not just on me, but into the arms of the one person I thought would always protect me. And Danielle? She had been in my life every step of the way. Girls' nights, brunches, birthdays. She'd listened to me talk about our marriage, nodded sympathetically when I said I wished Matthew would be home more. All the while, she was keeping him warm when I wasn't there. 2 days later, they went public. Social media lit up with pictures of them at a charity gala. She wore a backless red gown, his hand low on her hip, both of them smiling like they'd earned this happiness. Mutual friends called to check on me, their voices tight with the awkwardness of people who didn't want to take sides but couldn't hide which way they were leaning. The final blow came a week later when I learned the Cabo photo hadn't been a slip. It had been deliberate. A mutual acquaintance told me Danielle had been buzzing to tell her inner circle about the relationship, that she'd been holding back out of respect for Kendall until Matthew pushed her to just let it out. The text was meant for someone else, but she'd sent it to me instead. I'd thought betrayal was a single moment, a discovery, a shock, a clean wound, but it's not. It's a series of cuts, each one smaller than the last, but together they bleed you dry. For months I went through the motions. I moved into a smaller apartment, boxed up the wedding china, and stopped going to the places we used to frequent. I couldn't open Instagram without seeing their faces, sipping cocktails on rooftops, vacationing in Europe, hosting dinners in the very circles I'd helped Matthew break into. She was wearing dresses I'd seen in my own closet, laughing in restaurants where we'd celebrated anniversaries. The grief turned to rage the day I realized they hadn't just fallen in love. It hadn't been some impulsive, tragic mistake. They'd been building this for months, maybe years. Danielle had been collecting pieces of my life like souvenirs. My favorite wine, my favorite perfume, even phrases I'd used in conversation. I saw her use one in an interview for a lifestyle blog, word for word, and Matthew, he'd been using me too. The contacts I'd made in my event planning career had opened doors for him. Clients I'd charmed had turned into investors for his firm. And when I was no longer useful, he'd traded me in for someone who could keep him in the spotlight. The worst part? They looked untouchable. They were the golden couple. Wealthy, photogenic, philanthropic. Everyone wanted to be in their orbit. One night, about 6 months after the divorce papers were signed, I was sitting at my kitchen counter, flipping through a stack of unpaid bills. My business had taken a hit. Without Matthew's network, I was starting from scratch. I poured myself a glass of wine, turned on the news for background noise, and there they were, Matthew and Danielle, smiling for the cameras at a fundraiser. She was wearing a diamond bracelet I recognized instantly. I'd left it in our bedroom dresser when I moved out. The anchor was praising their commitment to giving back to the Dallas community. And I swear, I could taste blood in my mouth. That was when it hit me. They'd not only taken my marriage, my best friend, and my life as I knew it. They were parading the theft like it was charity work. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat very still, watching them on the screen, and felt something colder than grief settle into my bones. I wanted them to lose. Not just lose. I wanted them stripped of everything they'd built on my back. The house, the money, the social standing, the carefully curated image. I wanted them to know what it felt like to be laughed at behind closed doors, to watch doors slam in their faces, to wonder how it had all gone so wrong. And I wasn't going to just wish for it. No. I was going to make it happen. That was the night the grief died. And the plan was born. It didn't happen in some dramatic movie moment. There was no lightning bolt, no scream into the night sky. The decision came quietly, the way frost creeps across a window pane when no one is watching. It was a Thursday afternoon, about 9 months after Matthew left. I'd just finished setting up for a corporate luncheon at one of Dallas's luxury hotels. The event was flawless, the kind of execution that would have made any client rave. But when I went to collect my check, the receptionist handed it over with a tight smile. "Your ex-husband and his wife were here last week," she said, like she couldn't help herself. "They were asking about you." My stomach went cold. Asking what? She hesitated. "Just, if your business was still going. They said they were hoping you were doing well, but—" Her eyes shifted, embarrassed. "It felt more like they were checking if you were still relevant." Relevant. As if my worth could be reduced to whether or not my name still carried weight in the circles they now owned. I thanked her, smiled like it didn't matter, and walked out into the sharp winter air. That's when I saw them. Matthew and Danielle, stepping out of a black town car just across the street. He was holding her hand, laughing at something she'd said. Their perfect little performance still going strong. They didn't see me right away, and for a moment I just watched. He was in a custom suit, the kind that says, "I don't ask for prices." She was draped in a cashmere coat, her hair caught in the breeze like something from an ad campaign. And then they did see me. Danielle's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat. Matthew's didn't. In fact, his grin widened, but not in warmth. "No," his smile said. "Look at us. Look at what we became without you." He gave me a small wave, like I was some distant acquaintance, a ghost from another life. "Kendall," he called out across the street. "You look good." I wanted to throw the check in his face. I wanted to scream that without me, he'd still be clawing his way into parties he now got invited to. But I didn't. I just smiled back. Small, polite, forgettable. Because in that moment, I realized something. They weren't afraid of me. Not even a little. To them, I was done. Neutralized. A chapter closed. Matthew believed I'd stay in my little apartment, stringing together small events, watching from the sidelines as they expanded their empire. Danielle believed she'd stepped seamlessly into my place, upgraded it even. And that, I realized, was their mistake. It's easy to guard yourself against an enemy you see coming. It's much harder to defend against someone you've already decided can't hurt you. I didn't decide to take revenge out of impulse. I decided because I finally understood that they'd built their life on my silence, on the assumption that I'd take the hit and fade away. Every insult, every calculated move to erase me, was a bet that I wouldn't fight back. They were wrong. That night, I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and pulled out an old leather-bound notebook I hadn't touched in years. It had once been filled with ideas for my business, dream venues, client wish lists, budget breakdowns. Now, I turned to a blank page and wrote one word at the top in black ink: reckoning. I listed everything they had that could be taken: money, reputation, influence, relationships. I thought about the events that kept them visible, the investors who backed Matthew's firm, the charities Danielle used to polish her image. All of it was delicate, like fine china, beautiful on display, but easy to shatter if you knew where to hit. And I knew exactly where to hit. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. I followed society columns. I lingered at the edges of the same galas and luncheons they attended, never speaking to them, never drawing attention, just watching. Who they spoke to first, who they ignored, who left early after a tense exchange. I started reconnecting with old contacts, not in obvious ways, but through casual coffee catch-ups and industry mixers. I asked questions without asking questions. People love to talk if you make it seem like they're the one doing you a favor. Matthew's business was booming, but I learned it was stretched thin. Too many high-risk investments designed to impress the right people, not necessarily to turn profit. Danielle's influence was equally fragile. She had friends, yes, but they were the kind of friends who love you while you're shining and disappear when the lights go out. The more I saw, the more I realized I didn't need to attack them directly. I just needed to create the right cracks and let gravity do the rest. One evening, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, applying lipstick before heading out to an art auction. Not because I cared about the art, I cared about the guest list. Danielle's name was on it. As I looked at my reflection, I thought about how far I'd come from that night in the rain when Matthew admitted everything. Back then, I'd been raw, wounded, desperate for answers. Now, I felt nothing for him but a cold, clean purpose. I wasn't going to confront them in public or send angry messages. That would give them the satisfaction of seeing me emotional. No, I'd be friendly if I had to. I'd smile at the right moments, shake the right hands, and let them believe I was exactly what they thought, harmless. Because if they saw me as harmless, they'd never see the knife until it was between their ribs. At the auction, I arrived just late enough to be noticed. I made my rounds slowly, speaking with people who once only knew me as Matthew's wife. I dropped subtle hints about my new projects, careful to position myself as someone with growing influence. And then I saw them across the room, Danielle in emerald silk, Matthew in another perfect suit. She clocked me first, and I caught the tiniest flicker of discomfort before she smoothed it over with a smile. "Kendall," she said, pulling me into a light hug that smelled of expensive perfume. "It's been forever." "It has," I replied warmly, as if I hadn't once considered throwing her into traffic. "You look wonderful." Small talk followed, shallow, harmless, almost boring. But while we spoke, I noticed the man standing just behind her shoulder, watching me curiously. I recognized him, a real estate developer Matthew had been courting for months. When Danielle turned to greet someone else, I met his gaze and smiled. It was the kind of smile that says we should talk sometime. Matthew didn't notice. He was too busy working the room, shaking hands, laughing loudly. He never once looked at me like I was a threat, and that was fine. In fact, it was perfect. By the end of the night, I'd left with 3 new phone numbers, 2 dinner invitations, and a mental map of where their world was most vulnerable. On the drive home, the city lights blurred past my windshield, and I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. The fear, the grief, all of it had burned away. In its place was precision. Matthew and Danielle thought they were still writing the story. They didn't know I had already picked up the pen. The first rule of a perfect revenge is patience. You can't force it, can't rush it, can't let the hunger for the win make you sloppy. Matthew and Danielle were the type to assume threats were loud, messy, obvious. I was going to be quiet, precise, surgical. The second rule? You don't move until you know the entire board. I started with information, not gossip, but leverage. Gossip gets you conversation. Leverage gets you results. The real estate developer I'd smiled at during the auction was my first inroad. Over dinner, I learned he had money tied up in one of Matthew's ventures, a luxury condo project that was months behind schedule and bleeding cash. Investors weren't panicking yet, but delays like this had a way of attracting questions. From there, I began mapping Matthew's professional connections like a spider web. I pulled from my old contacts, searched public records, cross-referenced corporate filings. Late nights with black coffee and my laptop became my new normal. I learned which deals were solid and which were smoke and mirrors dressed up in a press release. I found out which friends of theirs were in it for loyalty and which were just riding the wave. With Danielle, it was a different approach. Her influence wasn't in contracts or assets, it was in her image. She'd positioned herself as a darling of the Dallas philanthropic scene. I made a point of attending the same charity events, not to talk to her, but to talk to the people who talked to her. Socialites, donors, PR reps. I didn't badmouth her. I didn't need to. I just listened, occasionally dropping a faint note of concern about whether she was taking on too much at once. The seed was planted. The beauty of this phase was that they didn't even notice. I was in their periphery, but not in their way. At one gala, Danielle passed me in the powder room and smiled like she was being gracious to a stranger. At another, Matthew barely nodded from across the room. Perfect. The first real test came 3 months in. I'd been building a relationship with one of Matthew's junior partners, a bright, ambitious guy who felt perpetually overlooked. Over lunch, he let slip that Matthew was courting a major client whose portfolio could double the firm's valuation. But the deal wasn't official yet. That night, I sat at my desk and stared at the notes I'd taken. If I could redirect that client, or even cast doubt on Matthew's ability to close, it could destabilize his firm enough to make the other investors nervous. But moving too soon would be reckless. I needed a reason for the client to trust me more than him. The opportunity came faster than I expected. The client's wife hired me to consult on a charity gala she was chairing. I didn't push. I simply did the job so flawlessly that she began inviting me for coffee, asking for advice beyond event planning. Slowly, the conversations drifted to business. One afternoon, she sighed and said, "My husband likes Matthew, but I'm not sure he's careful." I didn't agree or disagree. I just said, "Sometimes the best deals are the ones you don't rush into." That was all it took to make her think twice. It was dangerous territory. If Matthew suspected I was interfering, the game would be up. There was one moment at a fundraiser where I caught him watching me from across the room, his expression unreadable. My pulse spiked, but I forced myself to look bored, like I was checking my phone. He didn't approach. Danielle, on the other hand, was starting to notice my presence. At a museum opening, she made a pointed comment about how nice it is to see you out and about again. Her smile was brittle, her eyes searching. I matched her energy, complimenting her dress and moving on before she could probe. Behind the scenes, I kept building. I gathered evidence of Matthew's over-leveraged investments, nothing illegal, but enough to shake confidence. I compiled a list of every influential person Danielle had crossed without realizing it. The ones she'd snubbed at luncheons or spoken over in board meetings. Those people didn't need much convincing to rethink their loyalty. One close call almost cost me everything. I'd arranged a casual, chance meeting with an old college friend who now worked in city zoning, someone who could confirm rumors about Matthew's condo delays. Halfway through our coffee, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Turning slightly, I spotted Danielle at a table near the window, alone but facing our direction. I kept my tone light, laughed at nothing, and made sure my friend never mentioned Matthew by name. Later, I'd wonder if she'd followed me there or if it was just bad luck. By the 6-month mark, the structure of the plan was taking shape. Phase 1. Erode their social standing. Not by attacking directly, but by making them appear unreliable, overextended, and, worst of all in their world, replaceable. Phase 2. Undermine Matthew's business by quietly diverting key clients and creating hesitation in investors. Not enough to cause a public collapse, not yet, but enough to weaken the foundation. Phase 3. Turn their allies into liabilities. The people closest to them would either distance themselves or, when the time was right, feed the narrative I wanted the world to believe. But the final move, that had to be personal. It wasn't enough for them to lose money or status. I wanted them to feel it the way I had, in their bones, in their sense of self. And for that, I needed something intimate. Something that would cut them where they lived. The answer came in the form of an invitation. It was a charity ball hosted by one of Danielle's oldest family friends, someone I'd recently helped with a high-profile wedding. The envelope was thick, the kind you could feel was expensive just by running your fingers over it. Inside was a note. Would love for you to attend as my guest. I knew Danielle and Matthew would be there. I also knew this crowd wasn't just about money. It was about influence, and appearances mattered more here than anywhere else. If I played it right, this event could be the stage for my first visible move. Over the following weeks, I tightened every thread I'd been weaving. I confirmed that 2 of Matthew's investors were quietly shopping around for safer opportunities. I learned that Danielle had alienated the chair of a major fundraiser by showing up late and leaving early. And I found out the charity ball's guest list included 3 people they were desperate to impress. The risk was high. One wrong step, and they'd see me coming. But by now, I'd learned to operate in the spaces between moments, the pauses in conversation, the subtle shifts in tone. On the morning of the ball, I stood in front of my open closet, running my fingers over gowns. I chose a deep sapphire silk, elegant but bold, the kind of color you couldn't ignore. As I zipped it up, I caught my reflection in the mirror and realized something that made me smile. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about precision, control. Every move I'd made had been deliberate, every piece of information placed exactly where it needed to be. And now, the board was set. Matthew and Danielle still thought they were untouchable. They still believed I was background noise, a ghost of a past they'd already buried. They had no idea that by the end of the night, the first domino would fall. And I'd be the one to watch it topple. Dallas loves a spectacle. I gave it one. The charity ball was held in a glass-walled ballroom 30 floors up, the skyline glittering like it had dressed for me. I arrived on the arm of my husband, and the room parted without quite knowing why. They knew him. They all did. But no one had connected the dots just yet. Not Matthew. Not Danielle. Not until the program started. I'd choreographed the night down to the minute. The guest list. The table placements. Which society columnist sat near which investor? Which photographer always caught the unplanned moments? A floor plan is just a chessboard with better lighting. The quartet slid from one lilting piece into another while the crowd swelled and softened in tides. At the far side of the room, I watched Matthew do his circuit, grip and grin, loud laugh, promises with no paper behind them. Danielle was a few steps behind, flawless, practiced, shining under a halo that wasn't hers. The little things told me the pressure was already there. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear 3 times in a minute. The way he checked his phone between handshakes. Good. Let them feel the weather changing and not know why. The first cue was small. Our MC welcomed the evening's honorary chairs, Kendall Clark, Ellison. I didn't look at Matthew. And her husband, Grant Ellison. Silence isn't always quiet. I felt the room tighten. There it was. The soft gasp. The whisper moving like static. Ellison. In this city, the name stood on its own. Grant owned Ellison Capital, which owned controlling stakes in 3 funds, including the one that held a majority position in Westlake Partners. Westlake Partners, Matthew's firm. I didn't look at him, but I didn't have to. I could feel the blood drain out of his face across 30 feet of polished floor. Grant's hand rested at the small of my back, steady, grounding. We stepped up for the briefest welcome. I kept my smile warm, my tone low, my words about children, neighborhoods, schools, the kind of civic beauty that sounds like air but means money moves. Integrity, stewardship, responsibility. The values you invoke right before you pull a trigger. When we returned to our table, the second cue dropped. Phones buzzed like a hive. On screens around the room, the same push alert bloomed. Dallas Business Ledger. Westlake VP under internal audit. Expense irregularities, project delays cited. I hadn't written the article. That would be tacky. I'd simply placed the documents where they'd be found. Expense reports coded client development that were Cabo hotel suites and spa packages on a conference weekend. Private jet legs that landed nowhere near a client. A $14,200 red gown charged to a discretionary fund 2 days before the gala where Danielle debuted it. The ledger had done its job. It always does, if you respect its timing. Heads bent over phones. The murmurs sharpened. People glanced, not at me, but at Matthew, then back at me, then at the man seated beside me. I sipped water and watched Danielle's smile calcify. Within 5 minutes, 3 men detached themselves from the crowd. 2 Westlake board members and Westlake's counsel. They never looked toward my table. They went straight to Matthew, faces courteous but carved from stone, and asked if they could speak with him privately. The ballroom's terrace had been my staging ground. Glass doors, heavy drapes, enough separation for privacy, but not enough to hide expressions. I stayed inside, positioned where I could see the reflections. The city's lights turned the glass into a 2-way mirror. I didn't need to hear the words to know their order. The board met this afternoon. Your access is suspended pending the audit's completion. Company phone, please. Email credentials revoked as of 7 p.m. You may collect personal effects Monday under supervision. Matthew shook his head and smiled like they were joking. When they didn't smile back, his hands opened, pleading. The counsel reached into his jacket and handed him an envelope. That envelope had my words on Westlake letterhead. Policy citations, clause numbers, a clean paper knife. Inside the room, the MC announced the silent auction. Perfect. Everyone moved toward the displays clustered along the east wall, a curated gauntlet of art, trips, jewelry. My jewelry. Item, Zucker 47. Vintage diamond line bracelet. Platinum, 1920s with appraisal. A small bound packet lay beside it. The top sheet was the original appraisal in my name, dated 2 years before the divorce. Beneath it, a photo of me wearing the bracelet at our 5th anniversary dinner. Time-stamped, geotagged. Next to that, a recent screen grab. A still from a local lifestyle segment, Danielle at a microphone. That same bracelet glittering on her wrist, the camera crowding in close enough to count the prongs. I'd given the bracelet to the auction as a donation. I'd also given the documentation. The catalog copy was simple. Donor notes this item was previously mislaid and has been recovered. Recovered is a graceful word. It spares people the ugliness of stolen. Danielle reached the case and stopped. For a heartbeat, she didn't breathe. Then she laughed, a brittle sound, and lifted her chin. Coincidence, she told the woman beside her. These line bracelets all look the same. They don't, the woman said, too softly for Danielle to hear. But I saw it on her lips. A museum curator overseeing high-value items approached with the quiet firmness of someone who has seen every version of embarrassment. Ma'am, she said, may I speak with you about the provenance materials? Danielle smiled wider, until the smile looked like pain. Provenance? The curator gestured kindly. Of course. Across the room, the terrace doors opened. Matthew returned with the board and counsel close behind. His face was a color I'd never seen on him. Ashen, hollows deepening along his cheekbones. He went directly to Danielle, intercepting her and the curator with a raised hand. "Not now," he said. It wasn't a request. "It needs to be now," the curator answered, gentle but immovable. "For insurance." The word insurance has a way of bending a crowd toward you. Heads turned. Two photographers drifted closer, lenses down but fingers ready. I didn't step in. I didn't need to. Grant rose and tapped a flute lightly. "Before we begin bidding," he said, voice carrying without strain, "I'd like to thank Westlake Partners for their years of support for this charity. In times like these, stewardship matters. Our firm believes sunlight is the best disinfectant. To that end, we've engaged an independent auditor to review Westlake's recent expenditures and compliance. We will publish our findings and our corrective actions in full." The room went pin-drop quiet. Publish. He'd said it on a microphone, under a chandelier, in front of donors and press. No backroom, no quiet deal. Public betrayal earns public remedy. Grant wasn't finished. "We have also exercised our rights as majority LP to suspend 2 ongoing projects until that review is complete. Our priority is protecting our communities and our investors." I watched Matthew absorb the second punch. Suspend. He knew exactly which projects. One was his crown jewel, the luxury condo tower 3 months behind schedule that couldn't survive a funding freeze. The other was the smaller, flashier development he used for photo ops. Both were the bones under his suit. He broke then. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a swallow that didn't go down. A blink that took 1 beat too long. The human body hates humiliation. It tries to flee it any way it can. He turned toward me. For the first time in a long time, he looked directly into my eyes, seeking something he'd never get again. Familiarity, mercy, a rule of engagement he recognized. I held his gaze. I let him see nothing. The curator, still kind, addressed Danielle. "We have an appraisal and images that identify this bracelet as Ms. Clark Ellison's property. If you'd prefer, we can step into the office to resolve quietly." "Quietly," Danielle repeated, then glanced instinctively at the cameras. She knew what it would look like either way. She unfastened the clasp. Hands that had carved me out of my own life now shook as they returned what they'd taken. The bracelet made a soft, traitorous sound in the curator's palm. Metal on velvet. A pair of society reporters didn't even pretend not to watch. Danielle tried to laugh it off. Silly mix-up. The woman beside her, someone she'd snubbed last month without realizing it, smiled like a blade. Of course, small humiliations become big ones when people stop catching you. That's when the skirts of a crowd lift away and you're left without cover. I had one more cue. At 8:42 p.m., the city posted a public notice online. Stop work order, 3100 Ross Avenue, permit, RARS. The zoning department doesn't move for feelings, it moves for paperwork. I hadn't asked for a hammer. I'd asked for a review based on non-compliant change orders and expired temporary barriers. My friend in zoning had told me, rules are rules. Tonight just happened to be when the system finished chewing. The ledger pushed a second alert. Screens lit again. People didn't read it to themselves. They read it out loud. Stop work. Oh, isn't that Matthew's tower? By 8:45, 3 texts hit Matthew's phone from lenders. He didn't get them. Counsel had his device. I watched those lenders cross the room to Grant instead. Hungry dogs know where the meat moved. "Mr. Ellison," one said softly, "we'd like to discuss revised terms. Timing is theater. Impact is math. The difference between a scandal and a collapse is who's holding the microphone when the news lands. Tonight it wasn't Matthew. He tried to stand taller, to put steel back in his spine. "This is a hit job," he said to anyone who'd listen. "Sour grapes." The Westlake board member closest to him didn't bother to lower his voice. "Your reimbursements show 2 first-class tickets to Cabo labeled Client Development on a weekend with no meetings on the books. The spa receipts are consecutive, both on your corporate Amex. If there's a client there, we'll need their name." Matthew opened his mouth. Nothing usable came out. Danielle reached for him. He shrugged her off without looking. Loyalty is expensive when you only ever paid with borrowed money. The MC, a pro, tried to move us along. Let's begin the auction. Actually, Grant said, perfectly mild. One more note. Westlake's keyman clause is clear. Pending the audit's outcome, Mr. Lake's authority is suspended. Effective immediately, all communications should go through interim management. You could hear the word that mattered. Immediately. Who's interim? Someone asked. Grant turned his hand, palm up, inviting me to stand. Ms. Clark Ellison will serve as Westlake's interim head of community partnerships. She'll liaise with our investors and with the city to stabilize ongoing commitments. I hadn't asked for a title. Titles are decorations, but I'd accept this one, because it wasn't a ribbon, it was a key. I thanked the room, briefly, without triumph. No need to decorate the kill. By then, small groups were forming, the way they do when a ship lists and everyone pretends it isn't. One cluster peeled away from Danielle. Two women who'd once flanked her like parentheses drifted toward a different table and never looked back. Another cluster, contractors, the ones who don't have time for gossip because steel has to show up where it was promised, cornered Matthew with questions he couldn't answer. Who signs change orders tomorrow? Who releases draws? He tried to push past them toward me. Kendall! No one had used my first name in his mouth in years. Funny how men remember intimacy when the floor drops. Don't, I said, quietly. He stopped like I'd put a hand on his chest. You think this makes you noble? He tried. You married a wallet. I could have said a dozen lethal things, that he'd left me for a wallet and a mirror, that he'd used my contacts as rungs and sneered at the latter. Instead, I gave him the truth that would live longest. I married a man who doesn't steal. He flinched. Not at man. At steal. Security will escort you if you'd like to avoid the photographers, counsel offered, kindness masking procedure. I don't need... He did. They flanked him. Polite, professional, the way you walk someone through a place they no longer belong. Danielle tried to follow. The curator stepped into her path and, with the gentlest voice in the room, asked for the earrings too. Another mix-up. Another soft surrender into a velvet-lined tray. A society columnist scribbled, not bothering to hide it. The caption would write itself. The auction resumed because money has to move even when blood is in the carpet. People bid with a little too much energy. Relief is a currency. I stayed at my table, hands folded in my lap, and felt the air change like a storm breaking. No yelling, no glass shattering, just a sequence of locks turning, one after the other. The final blow wasn't mine to deliver. That's the thing about momentum. You set it in motion, and the world helps you finish. At 9:13 p.m., Westlake's PR email hit every inbox in the room. Statement. Effective immediately. Westlake Partners has suspended VP Matthew Lake, initiated a third-party audit, and paused 2 projects pending review. We remain committed to transparent, ethical development and will work with city officials and stakeholders to uphold that standard. The BCC list included the press. The press did what the press does. At 9:17 p.m., the chair of the charities board approached Danielle with a public smile and a private voice. We'll have the car brought around. We'll be in touch about your committee roles. It was the sweetest way to say you're done here. At 9:21 p.m., the developer Matthew had courted for a year shook Grant's hand and then mine. Let's talk Monday, he said. We want grown-ups at the table. At 9:26 p.m., 3 investors texted me directly. We'll stay if you're point. We trust you. At 9:30 p.m., security posted at the ballroom's private elevator. They weren't there for me. By the time dessert hit the tables, they were gone. No splash, no scene, just absence where arrogance had been. That leaves a shape behind, like furniture moved out of a familiar room. I didn't chase the feeling. I let it settle. I thought of the first night it rained and he admitted everything without blinking. I thought of the bracelet in a velvet tray, shining like a memory that finally remembered who it belonged to. Grant leaned toward me. You did it. No, I said, and let my eyes follow the city to the horizon. They did. I just turned on the lights. It wasn't mercy. It was math. Public sin, public consequence. They wanted me to live with the ache quietly. I wanted them to live with the echo loudly. By morning, they'd wake up to a world that didn't return their calls. By noon, lenders would have rolled terms they couldn't meet. By evening, Danielle's name would be politely removed from committees she'd once chaired. The bracelet would sit in a vault again until I decided to wear it. And Matthew would finally understand what no way back means. Not a door slammed in your face, but a house you burned so completely there's nothing left to rebuild. I stood to give the closing toast. The chandelier light caught the diamonds on my wrist, the ones no one would ever misplace again. To the city we love, I said, and the room lifted its glasses. May we be worthy of it. By Monday morning, Dallas was done pretending. The Ledger ran the story as its lead. Westlake Partners VP suspended. Audit uncovers misuse of funds. They paired it with a photo from the charity ball. Matthew, jaw tight, walking toward the elevator flanked by security, Danielle trailing behind with her eyes on the floor. No context needed. The picture said everything. Within 48 hours, 3 lenders had pulled financing on his condo tower. Without capital, the project defaulted on key contracts. Contractors walked off-site, and the city slapped a permanent stop work order. Investors moved faster than sharks smell blood. They stripped him of voting rights and appointed new management. The firm kept his name off every future project. Danielle fared no better. The bracelet wasn't what ended her. It was the way it ended her. The moment went viral on social media. A still frame of her unfastening the clasp, the curator's hand waiting, the caption, "Mix-up." Charity committees quietly removed her from boards, replacing her with women who didn't arrive with baggage. Invitations stopped arriving. People stopped looking at her as someone to know and started seeing her as someone to avoid. 2 weeks after the ball, they sold the uptown townhouse. The proceeds barely covered their debts. By the end of the month, they were living in a bland condo outside the city, one without valet parking or neighbors worth networking with. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't post anything that looked like a victory lap. Silence works better than any statement. The months that followed were clean. My business expanded. Old clients returned, new ones came through Grant's network, and the city zoning board suddenly found ways to expedite my event permits. I wore the bracelet again at my first major gala post-ball, and the flashbulbs found it every time I raised my glass. Then, in late spring, I got an envelope. No return address. Inside, a single folded sheet of paper. It was a handwritten note in Danielle's looping script. "Kendall, you got what you wanted. He's ruined. I'm ruined. Are you happy now?" I stared at it for a long time before I noticed something strange. The faint bleed of blue ink in the corner. A smudge, not from a pen, but from a stamp. I turned the paper over. There, barely visible, was the edge of an official seal. Texas State Bank. I didn't need the whole stamp to know what it meant. I'd seen those marks before. It wasn't a note sent from her home. It was from a branch lobby, the kind you sit in while waiting for a loan officer. That was when I understood the real twist. They hadn't just lost their lifestyle. They'd burned through whatever cash they had left. Danielle wasn't writing to clear her conscience. She was writing because they needed something. She thought guilt might buy her a meeting, maybe a check. I folded the note once, then again, and slid it into the back of my notebook, the one with reckoning written on the first page. No response. No mercy. No audience for their collapse. Because the truth is, revenge doesn't end with the public fall. It ends when they look around and realize the world they once ruled keeps turning without them. And that you were the one who learned how to live without blinking. And maybe, just maybe, that's when they start to wonder, if you had one more move left. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it stirred something in you, whether it was shock, satisfaction, or a reminder of your own experiences, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter, and I read every single one. If you enjoyed watching this unravel as much as I enjoyed telling it, please hit that like button. And if you don't want to miss the next twist-filled tale, make sure you're subscribed. Until then, remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply letting the truth do the damage for you.